Hey everyone, welcome back. In this episode, we're going to be looking at two or more different species with similar features. And we're going to be looking at some features that help to differentiate them from each other. Now, let's go ahead and dive right in.
Hey guys, welcome back. Today we're going to be looking at three different kinds of pines, three very similar pines, and I'm going to give you guys some much more clear differentiating features between the three of them. So we're looking at Pinus resinosa, the red pine, Pinus nigra, the Austrian pine, and Pinus ponderosa, the ponderosa pine. So in front of each one, we've got the cones. Now, the cone on the red pine, although typically they're not quite this flat, but it's the best I can do given the time of year that it is. And we got the Austrian, so they're very, very similar and very easy to confuse. But as you can see, some very clear differences between these two cones. And the color of the scales on the red pine is typically going to be much more grayish, and then the Austrian pine, which is going to be a little bit more on the brownish, orangish color there. And of course, the size of the cones is quite different as well. And then comparing the Austrian pine to the ponderosa pine is clearly substantially larger. These scales are much thicker and kind of a much more darker brown rather than the light orangish, reddish, brownish color that you're seeing on the Austrian pine. All right, and so for the needles, I'm going to have to do this in some kind of fashion here. So first of all, we'll look at the red pine and the Austrian pine. Now, typically, Austrian pine and red pine needles are very, very close in size, but there's going to be a lot of variation in those sizes. But they typically will range from 3-inch long to 5 or 6 inches long. That's pretty consistent. The red pine is going to typically be a little bit more, especially this time of year, kind of almost a lighter green, almost a yellow color, and they will kind of change back to a little bit of more of a green when we get into some warmer and hopefully some rainier weather here. The Austrian typically maintains a very stiff and waxy green look to it. One of the key identifying features, and they both appear in pairs of 2. Now, let's add the ponderosa pine to our needle collection here. Kind of hard to hold all 3 of these at the same time, but we'll do our best. So, as you can see, the ponderosa needles are substantially longer, typically hitting about 10 inches in length. That's pretty consistent. I can't even get this whole thing in the shot, but they typically appear in bunches of 3. Now, sometimes they are in bunches of 2, but they're going to be substantially larger, longer than the Austrian pine. The Austrian pine is much stiffer than both the red and the ponderosa, so these aren't quite as prickly as the Austrian pines tend to be. This one poked me pretty good earlier. And then as for the branches, as you can see, the red pine versus the Austrian pine, the needles are typically much more stiff on the Austrian versus the red versus the ponderosa, which they're much larger and not quite as stiff as the other 2. So now that we have taken a look at the cones and the needles, we're going to go ahead and take a look at all 3 pines and their bark. So by comparison, you can see the bark on the red pine has got much more prominent red and even some lighter gray tones in it, as opposed to the Austrian pine, which has more darker gray, almost black and white plates and streaks in it, as opposed to the red, or the ponderosa, which is predominantly a deeper brownish red color rather than this orange and lighter red color like what you see on the red pine. And then here on the ponderosa pine, you can tell that it's much less multicolored than on the red pine and the Austrian pine. It's going to be much more of a darker
reddish brown with little speckles of gray in there, kind of a lighter gray. And that's going to be pretty well consistent of these really large trees. And they're more of a, I've seen it described as kind of puzzle piece, blocky shapes that kind of almost fit together. I think that's a pretty accurate description. But yeah, the color is typically a much darker reddish brown rather than the lighter red and orange that you see on the red pine, or the white and dark contrast that you see in the Austrian pine. So those are probably going to be your best bark identification features right there. So the bark on the Austrian pine is going to differ greatly from the ponderosa and the red pine, because it's going to have a lot more of these light colored, almost white streaks and plates, and kind of almost a blocky, platy texture to them. Very similar to the texture of the red pine, but very different in color. The Austrian pine has a lot more light colored and darker colored contrasts in it, and that's going to be pretty consistent, especially on the older, more mature specimens.
Well, thanks for joining me today for this one. I hope this has been an informative episode for you, and we will see you guys next time.